This building, on the corner of Elm and Green Streets in Lebanon, is currently used by the Masons. It was built in 1879 as the Unitarian Church of Lebanon and was opened in 1880. The stained glass windows inside are inscribed with people's names. For the most part, they all knew each other. Some worked together on committees, lived near each other. In one case, they were related by marriage. They all contributed to the history of Lebanon in the 19th century. Jonathan Adams was born in Massachusetts in about 1798. He married Sarah Marsh Kenrick on March 27, 1848, in Lebanon. She was born in New Hampshire in 1824. Her father, Timothy Kenrick, was the Lebanon town clerk. Jonathan and Sarah lived in Lebanon in Sarah's parents' house. Jonathan was a civil engineer and chief engineer of the Northern Road. In the book History of Lebanon, it says that at a special meeting held October 8, 1850, while it was decided to fence the common, there was great diversity of opinion as to the form which should be given to the enclosure. Many advocated an elliptical enclosure. Jonathan Adams, the chief engineer of the Northern Road, laid out such a form, but it did not meet with general acceptance. Jonathan and Sarah had 2 children, Julius, who was born on July 26, 1852, and Francis Knowlton, born December 2, 1859. In 1865, Jonathan was one of the organizers of the First Unitarian Congregational Society of Lebanon. The family moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts. Jonathan Adams died in 1872. Ellen, Sarah, and Jenny were the daughters of Colby C Benton and Susan A. Wright Benton. All 3 daughters died young of consumption. Sarah at 17 in 1863, Jenny at 16 in 1867, and Ellen at 20 in 1870. Their father, Colby C Benton, was born in Langdon, New Hampshire on January 23, 1805. His parents moved to Hartford, Vermont when he was 4 years old, and then moved to Lebanon, where he spent most of the rest of his life. He married Susan A. Wright in 1841. Susan's mother was the daughter of Phineas Parkhurst, distinguished Lebanon doctor, and the first president of the Bank of Lebanon. In addition to the 3 girls, they also had a son, John, who also died young in 1848. Colby C. Benton worked as a merchant in Lebanon. He was interested in the development and improvement of Lebanon, especially in the organization of the Northern Railroad, assisting in the preliminary survey. Later, he was appointed to a committee to buy the necessary lands from the Connecticut River to the town of Franklin. He was also an adventurer. He spent a lot of time traveling through the southern and western states, and he wrote articles and books about his travels. He was a great lover of nature and found great pleasure in the culture of fruits and flowers and the study of the natural sciences. He had a collection of mineral and botanical specimens, which he mostly gathered with Susan, who accompanied him in his journeys. He was a historian, antiquarian, and poet. He also gained some distinction in the New Hampshire and Vermont militia. Colby C. Benton was a strong supporter of the Unitarian Church and provided financial aid for the construction of the church in Lebanon. He was a member of the executive committee. He died in 1880. His wife, Susan A. Wright Benton, outlived him by 9 years. After her husband died, Susan used the money she inherited to help the sick and needy. She donated Colby's mineral collection to the Lebanon High School district, and it was moved to Lebanon High School in 1888. She had much sadness in her life, and when she wrote her will, after leaving possessions to relatives, she wrote, "To some who should have been kind friends to me in all these years of loneliness and sorrow, but instead have treated me with neglect, indifference, and inattention, notwithstanding kindness in many ways to them, to say nothing of the gratitude they should have felt to my husband, I give my best wishes that in years to come, should they have a friend, aunt, or cousin, or anyone left lonely, as I have been, they shall feel for them and treat them with the common civilities of life. I cannot lose my self-respect so much as to wish them any of my worldly goods. Nothing but my best wishes for their reformation. Lydia Blodgett was born in 1804 in New Hampshire. She became the second wife of Seth Blodgett of Lebanon, who was a farmer. Lydia and Seth married on February 11, 1824, when he was 35 and she was 20. Lydia became stepmother to Seth's 3 young children from his first marriage, Emmeline, George, and Nathan. George married Agnes Austin, and they had a daughter, Emmeline, who died in her teens. His wife Agnes died in 1854, and George married Delia Thompson the following year. George and Delia had 2 daughters, Nellie and Annie. When Lydia's husband, Seth, died at the end of 1867, Lydia moved in with her stepson George and his family. George was a farmer in Lebanon and also a real estate broker. He was a trustee of the Lebanon Bank for many years. He died in 1885. His wife Delia remained in Lebanon, living on Green Street. The 1900 census listed her as an invalid, living with her daughter Nellie. Lydia wrote her will in 1892. She left most of her possessions to Delia Blodgett and her daughters. Lydia died on January 14, 1894, in Hopkinton, New Hampshire, at the age of 90.
John Burnham was born in Enfield, New Hampshire on May 8, 1798, son of Grover Burnham and Mary Story. He married 1828 Hannah Dustin Arvin. John came to Lebanon from Enfield in 1825. He was a shoemaker of superior skill who employed several workmen. His shop was where the Baptist Church is now. Later, it was near the CCB. Industrious and economical to a fault, he acquired considerable property near his trade, which grew to more than comfortable proportions after his active labor ceased. He was made a mason in 1826 and raised to the degree of master mason the same year. It was said that he was the oldest mason in New Hampshire. He was treasurer of the lodge for many years. He was more than of ordinary intellect, a good citizen, quiet and unpretentious. If he had his faults, it was the tender side of him, and his Masonic brethren saw and felt the most conspicuous manifestations, for he was much in love with Masonry and its teachings. He attended the Unitarian Church, loving the service. He contributed largely towards the erection of its house of worship and was the principal donor of its organ. His son, George Arvin Burnham, died August 11, 1842, at 7 years, 5 months old. Another son, John Moore Burnham, died March 16, 1862, at 31. John Burnham died at his residence on Depot Street, September 7, 1890, at the age of 92 years, 4 months. His funeral was held at the church he loved. His casket was covered by a sheath of wheat, beautifully designed, the gift of the Unitarian Society. He was buried with Masonic honors, cut short by pouring rain. He also left in his will to the church $5,000 in trust to be distributed each year, only the income from that. William Scott Cotter was born September 28, 1842 in Warner, New Hampshire. William Scott Cotter was the son of William Cotter and Hannah Badger. In the summer of 1862, he entered Dartmouth College, but almost immediately enlisted in the 11th Regiment, New Hampshire Volumes, as a private. He was later appointed commissary sergeant of the same regiment. He participated in the campaigns of Fredericksburg, Vicksburg, and Grant's campaign up to the Battle of Petersburg. He was discharged at the close of the war at the age of 23. He married 1868 Theodora Bugbee. Having sacrificed his education to serve his country, he entered into the employ of his uncle, H.W. Cotter, who was a wholesale dealer in gentlemen's furnishings and small wares. William took charge of his store in Lebanon. In 1877, he entered into a partnership with Frank C. Churchill, Cotter and Churchill. They manufactured men's working clothes and sporting goods. When Mr. Churchill withdrew from the company in 1898, Mr. Cotter continued as president of the corporation. He was president of the Lebanon Electrical Company. Committee to build the Lebanon Public Library, member of the State Senate 1901 to 1902, director of the National Bank of Lebanon. William Scott Cotter bequeathed a tremendous amount of money to the town and local organizations. He donated the Cotter Community Building, CCB, along with monies for upkeep. His bequests amounted to $155,000. Before his death, July 2, 1931, in Lebanon, he had donated $175,000 to various organizations. Excerpts from the Granite State Free Press, July 10, 1931. List of bequests in his will. CCB upkeep, $75,000. Lebanon Public Library, $10,000. Congregational Church, $5,000. Orphans Home in Franklin, New Hampshire, $5,000. American Missionary Association, $10,000. Board of Ministerial Relief, $10,000. KUA, $10,000. Proposed Alice Beck Day Memorial Hospital, $20,000. Student Relief Fund, $10,000. The income was to be used for LHS student to go through college. In the 10 years before his death, he donated the building of the CCB and donated to the city $85,000. American Missionary Association and Board of Ministerial Relief, $50,000. Mary Hitchcock Memorial Hospital for the X-ray wing, $40,000. And William S. Cotter still had enough money to take care of his wife, who died in 1938. Captain Charles H. Clough was born November 22, 1842 in Enfield. He was the son of John Clough, M.D., and Helen Clough. The family came to Lebanon from Enfield in 1858. Charles served in Company G, Shaw Rifles, 3rd Regiment, New Hampshire National Guard, being captain of his company for 5 years. He was secretary of the local Republican organization. He was a member of the Franklin Lodge No. 6, F and AM, Masons in Lebanon, and a member of the St. Andrews Chapter No. 1 RAM, and the Sullivan County No. 6 in Claremont. He married 11/28/1874 Frances L. Baker, born 1853, daughter of Rufus Baker and Mary E. George. She died August 1, 1890. Charles practiced dentistry and was in partnership with C.A. Curie and Clough. In 1889, he dissolved his partnership with Curie and accepted the position of postmaster in Lebanon. From the Granite State Free Press, December 19, 1890. He possessed a most genial nature, looking up on the bright side of everything. He was always gladly met by his acquaintances on the street, in businesses, or in society. He put his life and good feeling in the foreground wherever he went. The death of his wife was a severe blow to him, and it was deep grief that brought on the exposure and made him so ready to go to the way of all the earth when he realized his critical condition. He died only 19 weeks after his wife died. Lebanon will miss him. The funeral was held at the Unitarian Church, which was greatly crowded, many being unable to gain admittance. Franklin Lodge paid the last Masonic honors to their dead brother. There was an escort of 25 Sir Knights. The Shaw Rifles also served as an escorting body. Pliny Earl Davis was born July 4, 1808 in Burnham, Vermont. He was the son of Ichabod Davis and Susanna Ellis. 1810 to 1820, Pliny was in Vermont. In 1830, he was in Royalton, Vermont. He married first on May 6, 1830, Louisa Parkhurst in Royalton, Vermont. She died in 1847 in New York City. Married second, October 13, 1849, Emmeline Wallace in Baltimore, Maryland. She died 1867 in Royalton, Vermont. 1850, he was in Columbus, Ohio. In 1860, he was in New Orleans, Louisiana. On June 8, 1861, he enlisted in the Crescent Blues, Company K, 15th Regiment, Confederate States Army. His enlistment papers say he transferred to the Confederate States Navy in June 1861. His enlistment papers stated that he served until April 1, 1865. Pliny was in business in New Orleans before coming to Lebanon, about 1867. He married third, May 18, 1868, Philina Hayes in Barry, Vermont. In 1870 and 1880, he was in Lebanon. Pliny Davis's death notice. This is an excerpt from the Granite State Free Press, July 20, 1883. Sudden death. Pliny E. Davis, Esquire, one of our prominent citizens, died suddenly last evening at 75 years of age. Shortly before 10 p.m., he grew ill with asthmatic turns that he was subject to. He died about 10:30 p.m. Mr. Pliny was born in Burnham, Vermont, and a man of very active business habits in his better days. He was in business in New Orleans, Louisiana, but came here shortly after the war. He outlived 2 wives and had married his 3rd wife soon after coming to this town. Mr. Davis leaves also a son by a former wife in New Orleans, one in San Francisco, and a daughter in Cincinnati, Ohio. The funeral notice from the Granite State Free Press, July 27, 1883. The funeral of the late Pliny E. Davis, who died very suddenly on Thursday evening, the 19th, was held Sunday at 11 a.m. from the Unitarian Church. The attendance was much larger than could be accommodated. Notwithstanding large numbers stayed away because it was evident that they would not gain admittance. He was buried with Oddfellow honors. Over 80 members of the Mascoma Lodge, of which he was a past master, attending. Reverend Mr. Stebbins paid a suitable tribute to the character of the deceased, and all the exercises, including those of the fraternity at the grave, were very impressive. The floral display was very elegant, both at the residence and the church, all the gifts of loving friends. One beautiful feature at the cemetery was the lining of the entire grave with evergreens, while the unsightly pile of gravel was entirely hidden from view by a bank of evergreens and flowers.
CHI are the initials of Caroline Haskell Ingersoll. She memorialized her parents and brother in the window. Her father, Reverend George Goldthwaite Ingersoll, the only son of Major George and Martha Goldthwaite, was born on July 4, 1796, and studied at the Lawrence Academy in Groton, Massachusetts, and at Exeter Academy. He graduated from Harvard in 1815 and from Harvard Divinity School in 1818. Reverend Ingersoll was ordained in 1822 and became pastor of the Unitarian Church in Burlington, Vermont. While visiting relatives in Keene, George met Harriet Parkhurst, who was a pupil at Miss Fisk's school. She was one of the daughters of Dr. Phineas Parkhurst of Lebanon, New Hampshire, and was born in 1796. George and Harriet married in 1822. They had 4 children. 2, Harriet and George, died as infants. They also had a son, Alan Parkhurst Ingersoll, who died at age 36, and a daughter, Caroline. Reverend Ingersoll resigned his position as pastor in Burlington in 1844 due to ill health. He settled in East Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1847, but resigned 2 years later, also due to ill health. He and his family then moved to Keene, New Hampshire. At the centennial celebration in Keene in 1853, he read a witty poem on local matters. He spent the winter of 1859 to 60 preaching in Charleston, South Carolina. He died in Keene on September 16, 1863. At his memorial, it was said that he was a polished, genial man with charming manners and a kindly wit. Their daughter, Caroline Haskell Ingersoll, was born in 1827 in Burlington, Vermont. She attended the Lawrence Academy like her father and Miss Fisk's school in Keene. An article written about her said that, with a refined taste for the beautiful in nature and art, she was an accomplished musician and was likewise remarkable for her executive ability. Learning that a beautiful pine grove in West Keene was about to be cut down for lumber, she immediately took up the work of preserving it for a public park and raised the funds for its purchase by subscription from the ladies of Keene, aided by a few gentlemen of Keene and former residents who had left the town. It was named the Ladies' Park, and she presented it to the city in 1887 as a gift from herself and the other subscribers. Ladies Wildwood Park is still there today.
I'm Bill Dow. I'm the Deputy City Clerk for the City of Keene, and we are in possession of the Ingersoll collection. So Caroline Ingersoll has a set of diaries down at our Historical Society, in the Cheshire County Historical Society, and I have had the opportunity to read through some of them. And one of the diaries was of a trip she took to England in the late 1880s, and in it she writes about her experiences in England, and one of her most exciting experiences was seeing the carriage of Queen Victoria stride by as they were on the English London streets, and that was a big thrill for her, so that was kind of interesting to capture. She seemed to have a fascination for the royalty, the English royalty, and that resides in a lot of their collection has a lot of very nice things because I think they valued their family relics.
Caroline died of cancer in Keene in 1893. She bequeathed to the city of Keene $1,000 as a fund to be used for the care of Ladies' Park. She also made several other bequests to various institutions in Keene, and $1,000 for a fountain in Keene Central Park as a memorial to her brother, to be called the Alan Ingersoll Fountain. She also bequeathed $5,000 to Harvard University to establish the Ingersoll Lectures on Human Immortality, named in memory of her father. They began in 1896 and have continued every year since then. Caroline, her parents, and her brother are buried in Washington Cemetery in Keene.
Robert Kimball, Esquire, was born December 16, 1786 in Plainfield, the son of Joseph Kimball, who was from Preston, Connecticut, and settled in Plainfield, New Hampshire in 1765. His mother was Robert Kimball's third wife, Eleanor Dunlap. Robert Kimball married Fanny Willis in 1817. She was a native of Hanover. His early years were spent on his father's farm. He went to college at Chesterfield, New Hampshire, He attended Dartmouth from 1803 to 1806. His classmates were Sylvanus Thayer, founder of Thayer School of Engineering, and George Ticknor, professor at Harvard. About 1810, he settled in Morristown, Vermont, and engaged in the mercantile business, in which he was very successful. While living there, he enrolled in the Vermont militia, and his company volunteered to go to Plattsburgh in 1814, arriving 2 hours after the battle. He also represented the town in the legislature. After living in Morristown, Vermont for 9 years, he returned to Plainfield to assist his aging father in 1819. When his father died in 1835, he was left with quite a bit of money for those days. On a ride from Philadelphia to New York in the company of Major G.H. Lathrop, he asked him if he knew of a suitable location to spend the remainder of his life. He purchased a home in Lebanon, and he was at once recognized as a leading citizen. In 1842, he served on the House of Representatives. He was an original owner of both the Concord and Northern Railroad and always retained some stock. In 1850, he was chosen as a member of the convention to revise the Constitution and occupied the seat next to ex-President Pierce, of whom he was intimate terms with. When Dr. Parkhurst retired as president of the Bank of Lebanon in 1840, Mr. Kimball was chosen to be his successor and continued until 1865, when the bank changed to the National Bank of Lebanon. At that time, he retired. He became a Mason during his residence in Vermont and joined the St. Andrew's chapter in Lebanon in 1828. Mrs. Kimball died in 1860. Robert Kimball died in September 1875. The Masonic fraternity was at his funeral in large numbers and performed a service of the order. He had 2 children, Robert Byron Kimball and Mary Elizabeth Kimball. Robert Byron was born October 24, 1827, in Plainfield. He spent 9 years in London, then in Ohio as a clerk and merchant. He returned to Lebanon and commenced business as a general merchant about 1852, with Henry Fales as a partner. His business successfully continued until 1870, when he retired. With the result of his labors and gifts from his father, he had a handsome estate. In 1872, he traveled to Europe and the U.S. He died March 17, 1877, at 50 years of age. Robert Byron Kimball never married. Mary Elizabeth Kimball was born January 21, 1834, in Plainfield, New Hampshire, and died August 10, 1913. Mary Elizabeth spent her entire life in the family homestead. She was educated at KUA. She was devoted to the care of the property and home. She was a devoted daughter and sister, and guardian of the welfare of her adopted daughter. Her first and dearest public service was during the Civil War, when she gladly labored, gave and sacrificed herself for the soldiers at the front and their bereaved and anxious families at home. Mary Elizabeth Kimball was instrumental in the Women's Relief Corps. There's a stained glass window in the Soldiers' Memorial Building dedicated to her. She was a pioneer in the prevention of cruelty to animals and children before any societies existed in this area. Wounded soldiers, ill-treated and orphaned children, abused animals, the poor, the sick, and the suffering of every class all had known and blessed the strength of Miss Kimball's hand and mind and the generosity of her heart. Her last 30 years were centered around the care and training of her adopted daughter, Anna, whose love and devotion made Miss Kimball's last years increasingly happy. When her daughter Anna married Dr. Eugene J. Grow, Mary felt her life work had come to a successful culmination, thereby rendering the last months of her life especially full of happiness. Full of years of honor with her daughter and son-in-law at her side, she peacefully breathed her life away. The funeral was held at the Unitarian Church in August 1913.
The Unitarian Church in Lebanon was built using funds bequeathed by Nathaniel Stores Jr. Nathaniel Stores Jr. was born on March 14, 1774, in Lebanon, where his father was a deacon of the Congregational Church. Nathaniel Sr. was one of the original settlers of Lebanon. Nathaniel Jr. graduated from Dartmouth College in 1796. He was described as 6 feet in height and a fine personal appearance, possessing a clear analytical mind. He had a jovial, social disposition, but never married. He became a teacher at Phillips Academy in Exeter, New Hampshire, then principal of the high school in Danvers, Massachusetts, and then principal of the Eliot Grammar School in Boston. He left his position there in 1826 due to ill health. He remained in Boston for the rest of his life, where he devoted himself to creating a phonetic dictionary of the English language. He believed that there were only 23 necessary letters in the English language, and that the way that English is written caused difficulty in learning it. He felt that if each symbol represented just one sound, it would be much easier to write English and much easier to learn it as a second language. He worked on his phonetic dictionary until his last illness made him so weak he had to stop. He directed that his nephew, Dan Stores Smalley, should prepare and publish the dictionary, and that the expenses of writing and publishing it should be taken out of Nathaniel's estate. Nathaniel Stores Jr. died in Boston on June 16, 1851, at 77 years of age. He is buried in the School Street Cemetery. His dictionary was published in 1855 by his nephew, and 1,000 copies were printed. Watson K. Eldridge bequeathed the land on which the Unitarian Church was built. He was born on July 23, 1801. He married Colby C. Benton's sister, Cynthia, in 1830. She was a widow, 3 years older than Watson. She had a daughter, Mary Ann, from her first marriage. Watson K. Eldridge was a farmer, but subsequently was a sheriff and auctioneer. In 1841, at Lebanon's annual meeting, Watson was appointed to the committee to fix up the Lebanon townhouse. In 1857, he was a representative from Lebanon in the State House of Representatives. He was on the Claims Committee. He died on January 31, 1861, at 59, of Bright's disease. He bequeathed a large portion of his estate to the Unitarian Society, and the parcel of land on Elm and Green Streets on which to build the church. His wife Cynthia died on August 4, 1869, when she was 71. Cynthia's daughter Mary Ann died in 1873, at 54 years. She had been a seamstress. Watson, Cynthia, and Mary Ann are buried in School Street Cemetery. In his will, Watson left an estate yielding about $500 per year, the interest to be used annually for such project as the town sees fit to vote. In 1888, the town voted to appropriate the income of the Eldridge estate to the establishment and maintenance of a public library. The library was dedicated on April 22, 1889. The current Star Hill Conservation Area in Lebanon is partly on the Eldridge estate. The First Unitarian Congregational Society of Lebanon was organized November 7, 1865, by Colby C. Benton, George Blodgett, Jonathan Adams, Joseph M. Perkins, and Henry Fales. Some years prior to the organization of the society, Nathaniel Stores of Boston, a former resident of Lebanon, bequeathed to the Unitarian Society the sum of $5,000, the income to be used for the support of preaching. Watson K. Eldridge, a resident of Lebanon, bequeathed to the town and the Unitarian Society a large portion of his estate and set apart a lot of land situated on the corner of Elm and Green Streets upon which to erect an edifice. Both these bequests provided that a Unitarian Society should be organized and a church built and preaching maintained. From 1869 to 1879, services were only occasionally held, simply often enough to keep up the organization. In 1879, there was a renewal of interest, and action was taken toward the erection of a church edifice. A side note from the Granite State Free Press of August 2nd, 1879. Workers were hoisting a large 30-foot beam for the roof when it broke away from the rope and struck Aaron M. Burnham, the architect and builder of the church. A nail punctured his lung, and he died the next morning. His body was brought to Montpelier, where he lived. The church was erected and was dedicated April 15, 1880. The Masons bought the building in 1969.